The end is near. We are now beginning our next to the last unit, and that is modern art. This is a unit that I warn my students about. There's a natural tendency to dislike abstraction, to dislike modern art, and to sort of want to hate it. But we're not going to spend an eternity on it. I don't require that you like it. I just want you to sort of understand what the big ideas of the 20th century were. So that's why we do this. So let me see. Got to move through my map. So here's a map, and you can see now we've expanded our world to include the west coast of the United States and Mexico. So we're going to see art from all over. So World War I significantly transformed European politics, economics, and culture. The 1929 New York stock market crash plunged much of the world into the Great Depression. German aggression toward Poland in 1939 led to the outbreak of World War II in Europe and Asia. Technological innovations resulted in deadly devices such as the fighter bomber and the atom bomb, as well as the first analog and digital computers. Revolutionary developments in art and culture were dubbed modernism. A succession of movements or isms occurred in the 20th century. Foremost was a tendency toward abstraction, going so far as non-representational art at times. The goal of almost all movements was to break with traditions and redefine art in new terms for the 20th century. So this is where we left off. I had introduced my theory of being two mainstreams that came out of French Impressionism, and one was expressive art that expressed the feelings of the artist and tried to evoke feelings in the viewer. And the other was analytical, which was a more scientific approach to painting, or pseudo-scientific. So that's where we left off. Now, those two streams will continue into the 20th century. So we have expressive art, like I just told you, analytical, and we also have political activism, which was a thread that came from, well, I showed you some pieces in the early 19th century, especially Goya from Spain, and we're going to see more political activism where artists are particularly concerned about situations out in the world, not in their inner world, but in the outer world, and attempt to rectify or bring to the attention of the public things that they think need to be fixed. So what we mostly see is a total break with art traditions of the past. So we're going to start first by continuing our look at expressive art, and expressionism, just to remind you, is a term for art which emphasizes the feelings and emotions. And these are a couple of expressive pieces that start off early 20th century here. They're not required or anything. So there's several different groups of artists who are considered expressionists, and we're going to look at them in order. You don't need to distinguish these. I include this because I feel like my introduction to 20th century art needs to have these, and some of you might be art history majors, or you might choose to take a course, and so I just want to be comprehensive. I don't want to omit anything. But for the quiz, you just will need to know expressionism, and that's it. So the fauves is the first group we're going to look at. That fauve is a French word meaning wild beast, and they got that name because their colors were just so wild and crazy. So fauves were known for revolting against painting traditions, often using brilliant colors arbitrarily. So our poster boy for fauves is Henri Matisse. He's very famous. He had a very long career, prolific artist in many different media in the 20th century. But we're just going to look at one painting of his, and this is The Joy of Life. And it shows a bunch of nude figures lounging in a park. So the subject is very consistent with French Impressionism. you have people at leisure, relaxing, enjoying themselves in a park-like setting. The only difference, of course, is that they are nude, which you probably would not see even in France. And then the fauve quality of this is that there's just strange colors. Mostly the human figures are pinks, but there's some pale greens also. And then the grass is yellow. And if you look at the tree colors, there's a variety of colors there. So just using the colors in a way that is expressive of feelings and not necessarily representational of the way the world looks. That's what fauves were about. The next group we're looking at is Die Brücke, and this was a German group. The word Brücke or Die Brücke means the bridge, and what they saw was, or what they were attempting to do was to build a bridge to a better world by tapping into basic human qualities as seen in primitive cultures. And if you saw me in class, I would be doing air quotes around primitive because that is a pejorative term. It's not PC anymore, but it was very much the term that was used in 1913. So by primitive cultures, they mean cultures that are in developing worlds, like in Tahiti. So that's why I put Gauguin's picture there to remind you that this is a continuation of an old idea, that there's something pure and natural in these unspoiled cultures. So Die Brücke, now look at the Kirchner painting without Gauguin there. And you don't see it. I know you don't. Because what you see is a rather stylized painting of some fashionably dressed people, some European people out. It looks like they're strolling on a street to me. So this is a street in Berlin. And what he's attempting to do, and what many of the German expressionists, including Die Brücke, are doing, is they're looking at African forms, like African masks, and trying to get that sort of simplicity and that strength, that fierceness there into these. So I've got a few more notes on this. This painting captures the paradox of barbarism on the verge of being unleashed in urban life. Harsh, raw colors and tilted, brutal perspective convey immediacy. So I don't know if you get it. Not all of the expressionists are able to communicate, but that's what the goal of that one was. Our next piece is by a woman artist, Quettakovetz. She takes full advantage of etching techniques to express peasants' emotive energy against their oppressors. She used expressive qualities of line and form for social critique, horrors of war, poverty, and social injustice. So here she's showing peasants moving as like this mass of almost like animals coming down a hill. And her expression is different. I think if you saw more of her work, you'd see that she really values the underdog and values the workers. So, but anyway, this is Quettakovetz. No color here, so not at all fauvist. Paula Modersohn Becker. I usually just skip this one. So she shows evidence of Gauguin's influence in this self-portrait with an amber necklace. From the prominent eyes, so she's got very well modeled eyes up there too, the nudity adorned only with flowers and a necklace. Now, this is where I start to lose students, but stay with me, we won't be here forever. This is our next group is called De Blaue Reiter, and that means the Blue Rider. They were founded in 1911. They are an expressionist group of 9 painters who shared interests in the power of color, and they formed in Munich in 1911. So this painting by Wassily Kandinsky explores the relationship between painting and music, especially through the work of Arnold Schoenberg. In Improvisation 28, Kandinsky ventured into complete abstraction. Influenced by atomic theory, he had a lack of faith in the material world, and there is a vestige of a landscape in the work, but Kandinsky would rather have viewers look at the painting as if they were listening to a symphony and responding freely to the total experience in what can be called a visceral viewing of this, meaning don't engage your brain, just sort of let the paint and the colors and the forms sink into your eyes and just sort of emote, just sort of feel it. That's the goal for a lot of these artists, so I hope you can get to that point. So when I said that there's a vestige of a landscape, this is a fun one to ask my students about. Like, do you see anything in here? Do you see anything recognizable? And a lot of students will point out that there seems to be a little building back here on this, maybe a hill, and perhaps there's sky back there. And that's it. Other than that, it's just shapes and colors and movement. So this is Blauer Reiter. But Kandinsky is also a very influential artist, very important in early 20th century. Now, you've probably heard of Cubism, and I don't know if you know it. If you took art in high school, you might have encountered Cubism. Your teacher might have told you about that, but I'm going to give you a very, very brief overview of it. So Cubism was a style that was an invention, a joint invention of Picasso, of Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque. Cubism was a new launchpad for expressing views on contemporary life. Picasso went through an extraordinary transformation between early 1905 and the winter of 06-07, when the Louvre installed a collection of sculpture from Iberia. Iberia is the Spanish and Portuguese peninsula. So the painting we're going to look at is Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, and it was one of the most radical paintings of the time. It really shook up the art world, as you will see. In it, we will see simplified features and almond-shaped eyes, and these are thought to reflect Iberian and African influence. Picasso shows prostitutes from a brothel, somewhat in response to the joy of life, which you've already seen. Women here contradict an enduring tradition of sexual availability in their angular poses and gazes. So here's the painting that shook up the art world. So give it a look. Give it a look. And it will. It has huge influence. So Picasso had intense personality. It's a lot of people now speculate if he was bipolar. Undoubtedly, he was very narcissistic. And in this painting, it was one of the most radical paintings of the time. Simplified features reflect African influence. He had just seen this exhibit at the Louvre. By the way, he was born in Spain, so he is a Spanish man, but he moved to Paris because it was the center of the art world. And he did some early painting in Spain. His father was an artist as well and taught him how to draw. And then he came up to Paris and got in touch with the art community there. So you've got these two streams in his life, Spanish and French. So Picasso shows prostitutes as an expression of the garishness of a brothel. They're not glamorous at all. And this is, okay, now we're going to look at the forms. So you can see, I don't think you would have any difficulty identifying these as women, but they don't look like any women we've seen anywhere. There's a tendency to sort of simplify the forms of the body. Like if you look at the arms, instead of like attempting to get that gentle curve of an elbow, he just puts in a real sharp angle. Breasts are just abbreviated by like an arc here. And then he does some other very strange things, like these two women on the right side have masks instead of faces, like he's put these rather scary, horrific faces I mean, they're not horrific if you see them hanging on a wall in an art museum, but if you saw them on a person, you might think they were pretty horrific. Then I want you to look at the breast on this woman in the upper right corner. It has been abbreviated as a square, and it's been shaded arbitrarily. So we've got shading coming from the right side, and normally if this artist were attempting to make it look illusionistic, the shading would be on the underside, the part that doesn't get the light. But he's just sort of doing it where he thought the composition needed it. And this is considered both, sorry, I had to move my cursor, both analytical and expressive. And I'll tell you the story behind it. So it's women in a brothel, and the expressive part of, I've already explained the analytical part where he's reducing the shapes into simple forms. But the expressive part is that it's biographical or autobiographical. When he was a young boy in Spain, he went to a brothel in Barcelona. That's where he lived. And it was on the street of Avignon, which is why they're called the Demoiselles d'Avignon, or the tardy women from Avignon Street. And as a teenager, he found the experience frightening. He found the women there horrible. They were not soft and inviting, and it wasn't a pleasant experience at all. So that kind of stuck in his mind. And here he is sort of bringing it out, putting it down on canvas, his feelings about the women in the brothel. So here's my chart now of the two streams that came out of French Impressionism. And here's Picasso. He has both streams working for him. He's being extremely expressive, the monster-like qualities of these women, and his feelings about those women, and he wants to communicate that in the painting, but he's also being very analytical with his way of depicting the shapes and forms of their bodies. So remember that name, Cubism. Now, I told you in that first slide that it was co-invented by Picasso and Brau. So we're going to look at them. So now, the Les Demoiselles was from 1907, so that was really early. There's stuff that Picasso did after that, but we're going to jump ahead a few years and look at this. Ma Jolie. So this is completely different in appearance. You can see that it's lacking any bright, brilliant colors like the pinks and blues of Les Demoiselles. And instead, it's a very, what we would call low-key palette. It's just browns and blacks, grays, and whites, so neutral colors. And then, whereas the Demoiselle was very easy to identify the subject of those women, this is extremely difficult. It really approaches complete abstraction. I think you can see that here. So this style of Cubism now is called analytical Cubism. And Picasso and Brau shared a studio during these years in Paris. And their painting style, as they co-developed this, is extremely similar. They both use the same palette, this an extreme vertical format. And, well, you'll see. I'll show you a Brau in a minute. So Ma Jolie here shows a fragmented still life instead of objects pushed to the front of the picture plane. So I ask students many times, can you identify anything here? And they're like at a loss. It's just shapes and forms. And want to point out as we fly past here that the shading of these planes, so look at how an individual plane like this one up here has been shaded, and it does resemble the shading of that square breast that I showed you in Demoiselle, that the shading is arbitrary. It just is where Picasso wanted it to be to make the painting fit or make it feel right. but it has nothing to do with being illusionistic and showing you where the light is or shadows should be. So this was Picasso's Majoli. And this is Braque, done around the same time, 1909 to 1910. And this was called Violin Palette. So the guy has given us a break here. He's given us a title that tell us what to look for. And so students and I have no difficulty finding out or seeing what we identify here as the violin. We can see the neck of the violin broken in several pieces, and there's strings, violin strings. Up here is the artist's palette. There's also sheets of music in here. So this is like music scores here. You can see the little scroll on the, and up here on the neck too. So this is Braque, and you also notice that the style is very similar. The palette, the colors, everything. Picasso and Braque were of the same mind. Now, I just wanted to fit this in with what we saw in the 19th century so that you can see this continuation. On the right is a Braque painting of a house in the country, or maybe several houses, and the arbitrary shading on the facets of the houses. And on the left, this one with the very bright blue sky is a Cezanne painting. So I showed you Cezanne. I introduced him as one of the analytical painters of PostImpressionism. And to me, they're very, very similar. So Braque is kind of picking up where Cezanne left off. I hope you can see that. And Picasso, who is absolutely one of the most prolific and influential artists of the 20th century, continues to work, and he continues to evolve. He doesn't stay in one style for long at all, but he does get to a point where he will develop his own kind of post-cubistic style that he will work in pretty consistently for many decades. But anyways, he's still in Cubism. He came up with this, and this is called the Bottle of Suze, as you can see, and it is what's called synthetic Cubism, because he uses collage and he starts sticking things on from real life. So we have a bottle label here, Suze. We have pieces of newspaper that he's just glued on, a piece of wallpaper down here, and then he's also used some drawing, like here's a, I'm going to say it's a glass, but there again we have that arbitrary shading where the surface of the glass that is shaded is the part that's coming towards us. It should be just the opposite. So this is synthetic Cubism. And so now you have seen the invention of collage. Nobody had done it before, but he did it, and so remember that. I'm going to show you several inventions today. So there's a lot of influence. I told you that Les Demoiselles shook up the art world, and there's reverberations for a long time. So many artists pick up different parts of that and interpret that in their own way, this sort of abstraction, this reduction of form, this abandonment of this desire to make things naturalistic. So this is, I'm looking for my notes on this, sorry. This is a style called Orphism from Sonia Delaunay-Turk. She she decorated the Citroën, the car, to match one of her fashion ensembles. So here she is in just kind of gritting colors. It's kind of interesting, but you don't need to know that. Another influence of Cubism is on the French artist Fernand Léger. Fernand Léger developed a version of Cubism based on machine forms and a style affected by his wartime experience. So right now Léger is working post-World War I. Three Women here is a machine-age version of the academic reclining nude. Léger thought his designs, which he thought were a positive vision of orderly industrial society, could promote social order. and he called this purism. So I failed to find the positive aspect of this. If anything, they really remind me of Les Demoiselles, because we have 3 nude women lounging around, possibly in a brothel. There's even a plate of food. There was a plate of food in Les Demoiselles. And there's nothing positive to me about this at all. It is very constructed, very orderly. You can see his arbitrary shading as well. So you've seen directly the influence of Picasso here. Here's another group that's also influenced by Cubism. So these are reverberations of Cubism, and this one I find very interesting. I hope you do too. I don't think it's going to show up in the quiz, but I think it's interesting. So the Futurist movement in Italy was based on the thrill, speed, and power of urban life. The group were anarchists. They wanted to destroy everything old, all the old order of art, the old order of society completely, in order to create a new, more perfect world. They were extremely optimistic about the 20th century. So as the 20th century opens and there's lots of developments in the world, lots of technology developing, automobiles, etc. So it gives everybody a real charge. So there's a group of Italian futurists. Did I tell you they were from Italy? Yeah, I think I did. And on the left is one of their paintings that I think represents what I just told you about them. This is called Snipers on a Train? No. I didn't write this down. Sorry. I think it's an armored train, actually. So we're looking down on a train that is moving through the landscape, and there are men in here with guns shooting out from it, and here's a cannon. But just look at the way the forms have been painted, and it should remind you stylistically of Cubism. And now this is the one that you will need to know, and this will show up in the quiz. This is Umberto Boccioni, Unique Forms of Continuity in Space. So this major work was inspired by Cubist figure studies. It features exaggerated muscular curves and counter curves expressing the figure's force and speed. So I think, even though it's greatly abstracted, you can get a sense that there's a figure sort of moving, striding forward, that we have a knee bent here and this leg extended here. But there's like this weight on their feet. Perhaps this, the blocks under the feet represent the past, and this figure is trying with great effort to move forward. So that really represents Futurism, I think. So here we've seen Expressionism, Cubism, and Futurism. And another painting that reflects influence from this Cubism is this painting, Natalia Goncharova. I really like this one. It's not going to be on the quiz either, but I mean, you've got to love this. It's just called Electric Light, and you have to think back to 1913, especially for Russians or Europeans, that electricity was new and it revolutionized light, or life. Suddenly you could turn on a switch and your house would be filled with light, instead of having little gas lamps that would really just be very much like a candle, very dim light. You can have bright light. And she was excited about this. So this painting is celebrating this, this power. And you can see down at the bottom these 3 concentric forms down here, concentric circular forms with light radiating out from them. It's just so cool. And up here is almost like the darkness that's being pushed away. But, you know, just sitting and looking at this painting, you can see it's completely abstract. There's nothing identifiable in there, nothing at all. Now, you ready for another abstract painting? Because this is where students do get very angry. So another Russian. Kazimir Malevich emerged as the first artist of truly non-representational art, completely free from any observable object in the physical world. This is called suprematist painting, and it's just 8 red rectangles. It focuses solely on the formal issues in an effort to liberate the essential beauty of all great art. So he did this with great deliberation, thinking that just these placements, the placement of these rectangles would be beautiful. I also like to ask my students if there is anybody who would find this impossible to recreate, and nobody ever raises their hand. So yes, it is something we could all do. We could all just make red rectangles and put them on a white ground. But the idea is that Malevich did it first, and his idea was new. So that is why he's in the textbook and we are not. So this and Goncharova represent the Russian avant-garde, and they were very excited in Russia about the revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, and they were very optimistic about the new Russia, about shaking off the old guard of the aristocracy and the Tsar, but things didn't go too well for them. So anyway, that's to be continued. This is the end of the first part of chapter 19. So be sure to watch the second part. Things are going to continue.